Hello everyone, Oli here, and this is my review of Remembrance of the Daleks. The first story of the 25th season of classic Doctor Who, starring Sylvester McCoy as the 7th Doctor. Remembrance of the Daleks is the 152nd story overall, it's 4 parts long and is written by Ben Aronovich. And of course, Remembrance of the Daleks is the third and final installment of the Dalek Civil War trilogy, and here it's an all-out war between the Imperial Daleks, led by Davros, and Renegade Daleks, led by I think it was the Dalek Supreme, yeah it was. And it all takes place in 1963, and this is where Doctor Who pretty much goes back to its old roots, and the Doctor seemingly has the final piece that could end it all. So the plot of the story is as follows. London, 1963, and the Doctor returns to Coal Hill School with his new companion Ace, where he has unfinished business. His orders for the Daleks are on the trail of Time Lord technology, an artifact the Doctor himself left behind on Earth. Enlisting the assistance of the local military, the Doctor must protect the Gallifreyan secret of time travel, as opposing Dalek factions meet in an explosive confrontation with the entire fate of the universe at stake. So that is the plot of Remembrance of the Daleks. Oh, Remembrance of the Daleks. Mwah. I absolutely adore this story. Not only is Remembrance my favourite McCoy story, it's actually my favourite classic Who Dalek story ever. And in the rankings of my classic Who stories, my favourite ones, The Seeds of Death would be number 1, Planet of the Spiders would be number 2, and coming in number 3 would be Remembrance of the Daleks. And that's how much I love this story. I loved it when I first watched it when I was 15 years old, which was almost 10 years ago, and I still love it now. And this is how Doctor Who should be. It's like, it really grinds my gears how the BBC didn't actually see the potential of the McCoy era, because they were still insisting that Doctor Who needed to be on a break. I think it's because they didn't understand the fucking plot. I think they didn't have anything like iPlayer back in the day, so they had to just pretty much rely on the first viewing, and it also upsets me even further that it took Jonathan Turner nearly a decade to finally find his vision for Doctor Who and stick to it, because a lot of his era was just very trial and error, and it just really didn't work. And Remembrance of the Daleks is proof that the Andrew Cartmel and his Cartmel master plan is something that could very much help Doctor Who in the future and going into the next season, and unfortunately got cancelled, as we all know. But it does definitely help in the storytelling in even stories in New Who as well. And the production, I must really say, was really good. I love how, even especially in this era, the location shoots are more integrated with the studio shoots, or the lack thereof of studio shoots, which makes Doctor Who more modern, because everything is now shot on video, so it really makes things more modernized. And obviously the difference between the very grainy film shoots that the show relied on back in the 70s, and even the 80s, and now it's all very much together, and it makes it more concise in a way. And I love how contemporary the story feels, even though it is set in 1963, almost 60 years ago to be precise, and it still feels very contemporary in a way. But I think it's because they filmed in Shoreditch, or at least I think it's Shoreditch, and I think Shoreditch back in the 80s or even now doesn't look like what it does look like nowadays. Very gentrified and very hipster friendly, but then I think it's because of the council flats that were near where the TARDIS had landed and the filming of the story. I think that's how it gives it more of an urban, suburban feel to it, so to speak. The special effects, I think, were some of the best I've seen in the classic series, and this is the first time we actually see a human getting exterminated by the Daleks, and we actually see the skeleton effect as well, and this obviously continued into the new revival as well. So it is a huge milestone to say the least, and the battle scenes were very well done, and I think it's definitely one of the best battle scenes of the entire Doctor Who, and the epicness and the level of effort that went behind it is just fantastic. It's just, I love it so much, especially the humans versus the Daleks in the Tortoise Lane junkyard in part 1, where the armed forces were going against the renegades, and of course the renegades and the Imperials literally fighting each other, and we see the special weapons Dalek just strolling in, just wreaking havoc on everyone. It is really, really amazing. The music score was phenomenal. It's a bit out of place for a story set in the 60s, but I love the 80s filter, and that's it. That's what really gives it a special feel to it. And I love, and I was really impressed with how the Imperial Dalek at the end of part one was able to hover over the stairs to try and kill the Doctor. But we'll get more into that later. The script was great. It does feature a lot of foreshadowing and a lot of elements that pretty much hint towards the Doctor's true identity. No, not necessarily the Doctor's true identity, well, in some areas anyway, but not too much was revealed. But the things that were did feel a bit too much were removed. But yeah, it was still quite good, and the direction by Andrew Morgan was just phenomenal. It's a very well produced story, and I admire that. And the plot itself was absolutely brilliant. Remembrance of the Daleks wraps up things in an epic way, with both Dalek factions along with Skaro getting wiped out because the Doctor used the Hand of Omega towards Skaro and tricked Davros into firing it, thinking that it was going towards Earth, but in actuality it was actually targeted towards Skaro. And this, of course, caused the last great time war between the Daleks and the Time Lords, according to Russell T Davis. And Remembrance of the Daleks is the last classic Who Dalek story, and so of course it makes sense to wrap up things in this way. But I'm sure, whilst the story is being written, it wasn't intended to have been the final Dalek story ever. But I'm sure they probably would have returned in the next era or so of Doctor Who. So, but it does pretty much wrap up the trilogy and the Dalek Civil War story, and that has been pretty much been building since the Tom Baker era. And I do like how this story kicked off the 25th anniversary season, and with it being set in 1963, it was very fitting. I liked how the Hand of Omega played a very big part in the story, and it actually starts the storyline of the mystery of the Doctor, as he explains that he made a mistake leaving the Hand of Omega back in 1963, and he left it when he was in his first incarnation, which makes things very, very, very mysterious. And I like how Sylvester McCoy was able to convey that mysterious Machiavellian side of the Doctor. And this storyline, of course, continues for the rest of his era, and obviously it would have continued if Doctor Who had been cancelled in 1989. It was all for the Cartmel master plan, and I'll explain what was in a future video, because if I explain it now, I like talking about this, so it'll probably take me all day, and I've already done a lot of takes for this review itself, so let's crack on with the rest of this review. So this story actually deals with other real world topics and issues as well, and it's handled very brilliantly. And I like how it integrates with these issues into the plot, making Doctor Who even more modern. One of the themes being racism slash white supremacy, and tying into Dalek supremacy as well. And this is where Ace discovers that Sergeant Mike Smith and possibly his mother are racist, because she was exploring the living room, and then she comes across a sign and saying no colors, and naturally she's horrified by this, and she actually goes to confront Mrs. Smith about this, but then she realizes it won't really do much of anything and decides to walk off in anger. And as we pretend, Ace actually mentions in the following season that her friend Manesha was killed in a racially motivated attack, and so it's very hard not to see why Ace is very angered by this. And of course, she does come from Perryville, which is a very, which I do believe is a very multicultural suburban area in West London. So, of course, Ace seeing a lot of diversity, and obviously seeing a lot of the racism, and obviously seeing her friend's death, obviously would have really messed with her as well. In addition to this, Radcliffe was heavily implied to be a Nazi sympathizer, and the fact that this actually flew over my head when I watched it recently, and having it actually mentioned in British TV actually shocked me. And when he said that he believed that he was going to be on the right side of history this time, and he was in prison for speaking his views, so that pretty much meant that he was on the side of the Nazis during World War II. So, and obviously we know how the Nazis were, so it's very likely that he was racist as well. And finally, the Daleks' own prejudice, not against other non-Daleks, but to each other, but which is the whole purpose of the war between the Imperial Daleks and the Renegade Daleks, because as you all know, the Renegades saw the Imperials as Imperial and wanted them destroyed, and the Imperials saw the Renegades as inferior, and as they were the original Daleks that Davros created. And Ace explains the purpose perfectly to Allerton as with the little blobs, and that was another great scene as well. And this story had some very incredible moments, Some of these being my favorite scenes ever in Doctor Who, and I could go on all day explaining how these moments are. Like the first few minutes of the story are amazing, with the cold open with the Dalek ship actually heading towards Earth, and with snippets of different speeches from different world leaders such as John F. Kennedy, who else? Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther, no, not Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and it was also just all overlapping with each other, and that's how we get to the title sequence. And after the Doctor and Ace arrive on Earth, like immediately they battle. Well, immediately the troops are battling the renegade Daleks in the Totters Lane junkyard. The others are completely clueless as to what happened to the fallen soldier, and the Doctor knew all too well what had happened to him. And that was an amazing scene. I did like how the Doctor actually was trying to catch the attention of a renegade Dalek by saying, "Oi, Dalek, don't you recognize me, your mortal enemy?" and proceeds to throw a natural non explosive toward the Dalek, which actually killed it. The part one cliffhanger was quite brilliant, and this is when the Doctor and Ace were trying to escape from Dalek basement. Ace is able to escape, but then she gets knocked out by, I think it was the principal, but then the principal proceeds to lock the Doctor in the room with the Imperial Dalek, and the Dalek is just pretty much hovering over the staircase, and the Doctor looks completely horrified in what's happening. He's just like, he can't really do anything because Ace is knocked out, but he doesn't know it. But then Ace is pretty much recovers, takes care of the principal herself, and rescues the Doctor. And of course, this is the first time we see a Dalek flying, or at least in midair for the first time. Although we did see a Dalek hovering in Revelation of the Daleks, but that was just fairly. But I think that was just another scene in itself. But seeing an actual hover was actually quite amazing, and is brilliant as well. And we also see Ace deal some damage towards some Daleks, which she whacks some Imperial Daleks with a baseball bat, and that was a moment that pretty much immortalized Ace as one of the all-time great Doctor Who companions ever, and it leads into the part 2 cliffhanger when she gets ganged up on by the remaining Daleks, and that was extremely epic. Not to mention that her earlier she actually destroys the Dalek with a fucking bazooka, and she was actually aiming for the eyepiece because the Doctor had actually said so to the troops that to weaken the Dalek, you have to go to destroy the eyepiece, and that was quite epic as well. And then another few moments that I liked was whenever the little girl appeared. It was pretty creepy as well, but I'll explain more on her in a bit. And other moments I also liked was when the Doctor was talking to John in the cafe about ripple effects, and the scene was actually meant to have gone on for a bit longer, but obviously, yeah, I think it was cut down for time. And then the special weapons Dalek, the one big ass Dalek, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, shows up and annihilates the Renegades. And other scenes as well which were quite cool was Ace rejecting Mike, Davros showing up, and the Doctor pretty much yelling at Davros, which was just a ruse to get Davros to fire the Hand of Omega, but Davros didn't know that it was going to be fired against Scar, which ended up destroying it. And then lastly, there was a little nice Easter egg after Ace had left the house in part 2, and when she was probably about to watch the first ever episode of Doctor Who, because the continuity announcer was introducing the show, but then as soon as he said Doctor, he immediately cut to the next scene, and that was very meta, and that was quite funny, and we do have a very meta story at the end of this season, so yeah, there is a lot of meta in the McCoy era, which I actually did pick up on and analyze it myself. Honestly, as I said before, there is a lot of epic moments to digest, but then I don't want to have my laptop crashing whilst I'm before filming this review, so but yeah, there are a lot of but other characters do a lot of epic moments which I'll explain in my character analysis of them, so yeah. It is a brilliant story with a lot of epic moments. So on to the acting. I think this is an awesome effort by everyone involved. Sylvester McCoy was just magnificent, and this is one of his best performances as the Seventh Doctor, and of course the Seventh Doctor's Machiavellian side is starting to unravel as he's very cunning, he's very scheming, and I like how the Doctor manipulated the Daleks for his own personal gains, or at least cover up his mistake by when he left the Hand of Omega when he was first situated in the Coal Hill area. And of course, the Hand of Omega, as explained by the Doctor, is a stellar manipulator that would be very deadly in the wrong hands. And both Dalek factions wanted it. Yes, but the Doctor actually wanted to use the Hand of Omega to wipe both Imperial and Renegade Daleks out. But to ensure this happened, he needed the Hand of Omega to be with the Imperial Daleks, not the Renegade. So that was pretty much his purpose for that. And after the Renegades were defeated and the Imperials were able to get the hand, he confronted Davros to surrender in an attempt to it was a ruse to try and to make Davros think that the Doctor actually wanted the Hand of Omega back, but this is pretty much in the last couple of minutes in the story, and the Doctor pretty much berates Davros and gets into it in a screaming match. And I honestly think that Terry Molloy got outhanded by Sylvester McCoy in the freaking landslide, and it was just so fucking epic to see because obviously the Doctor was trying to like taunt Davros and saying that he's pathetic, he's useless, and obviously Davros fell for it, hook, line, and sinker, and it was pretty much insulting the Doctor, pretty much calling him another Time Lord. This is a deleted scene, but then Davros got a response from the Doctor saying that I'm more than just a Time Lord. And then obviously the Doctor, then the scene that remained, and which is probably one of the Seventh Doctor's most memorable scenes, and the Doctor was like telling Davros, not in his speech, unlimited rice pudding, etc., etc. I can't do the rest because I already have a sore throat. I don't want to make it worse. And it just makes the story and that line pretty much makes the story very memorable and very iconic. And yeah. And then another underrated moment that I liked was when the Doctor was taunting the last Renegade Dalek after all the Daleks have been wiped out. So yeah, he does do some other good moments as well, such as talking to the blind priest in the cemetery who noticed that the Doctor's voice was different. And I like the scene where he was leaving the funeral home with the Hand of Omega, which was levitating, and the guy that was there was talking, and the guy that was there that was like working at the home, when he sees it, he just faints, and that was quite funny. But aside from that, the Doctor's jovial, goofy side still remains. Just a teensy bit, but then the Machiavellian side of the Doctor is very dominant in this story. And as I mentioned before, I did like the conversation he had in the cafe with John, but it was obviously cut for length, and I do believe that McCoy was disappointed with that. And of course, Sylvester McCoy has brilliant chemistry with Sophie Aldred, and it really makes the pairing of the Doctor and Ace very epic. And then the relationship actually makes the plot work, and I like how their relationship with each other is largely focused upon the next season. And speaking of which, Sophie Aldred did a brilliant job as Ace, and this is already one of her best performances. Ace, of course, does some very heavy lifting and gets involved in a brilliant way. She obviously, with her boombox or a ghetto blaster, she leaves behind in the school, and that's why she goes back in part 2 to go and get it. But then before all of that happened, she destroys the Dalek with a bazooka, and when she goes back to the school to retrieve her tape deck, she's armed with the baseball bat that the Doctor had pretty much used the Hand of Omega to amplify it in a way and that's how Ace was able to beat up and weaken some Daleks. And obviously throughout her time in the TARDIS, Ace usually has a special friend of the week that she usually gets close to. Sometimes there'll be male, sometimes there'll be female, which pretty much adds to the argument that Ace could be bisexual, but then obviously I think the writers did want her to be bisexual, but the BBC pretty much didn't want to allow that. So, and whoever Ace is friends with, they sometimes end up dead, or they're usually just as troubled or as naive as Ace was. But then in this story, she gets close to Mike, who she really liked, and then when she found out that he was a racist and was in league with the Daleks, Ace was immediately disgusted and even wanted to try and ask Mrs. Smith, his mother, what was going on, but she pretty much had to control herself and walk away. But then the final straw for her, and that pretty much ended things between her and Mike, was when he accidentally let slip about the Hand of Omega, which she pretty much Ace was just irate and pretty much wanted to kill him and throw her hands at him. But then obviously Mike ended up getting arrested, and this is what we see. This is what Ace is about, because she is very loyal to the Doctor, and she obviously has problems with those that oppose the Doctor, whether they be corrupt government officials or just nasty people in general. And obviously, Ace is the sort of person that relies on herself, and she obviously has the doctor who she takes care of and wants to learn from, and I do think that the Doctor and Ace are quite similar, and you do get to see Ace dealing with her personal demons in her trauma in a bit of this season, but then the following season it actually does get it explored in depth, and I think this story actually helps define Ace as what a Doctor Who companion should be, and I like how Ace single-handedly changed that definition herself. So on to the side casts, and they're all really good. I enjoyed watching every single one of these characters, even the let's not see that. So we have Sergeant Mike Smith. He was a sergeant for the Royal Air Force with Group Captain Gilmore's counter intrusions group, but he was actually a double agent for the Renegade Daleks. He was enamored by Ace and vice versa, but Ace was starting to become very wary of him when she found out that he was a racist and was working with the Daleks. And obviously, one of the reasons why is because Mike actually looked up to Radcliffe, which is probably why he was working with the Renegades. After he got arrested, he shows up at the boarding house to kill Ace, but he ended up getting killed by the little girl. So the funeral at the end of the story actually turned out to be his, and there were a lot of signs that he was a very bigoted character. He was at least working with the Renegade Daleks, as when Ace was struggling with the currency, with the shillings and whatnot. I was surprised that shillings actually did exist back in the 60s, but I don't really know, do I? He immediately asked Ace if she was from somewhere else. As in, of course, the no coloured sign in the boarding house. And Ace obviously put two and two together and realized that he was working with the Daleks when he accidentally let slip about the Hand of Omega. He was a very complex character, and the novelization actually makes Mike a lot worse, as he was saying a lot of sexist and anti-Semitic comments, and and I imagine if these comments actually made it into the story, it would have ended well. And then of course you have Group Captain Gilmore. He was the leader of the counter intrusions group, and although he was very stubborn and very close-minded when he was told that the Daleks weren't human, and he insisted on doing things his own way, which actually annoyed the Doctor. But then he allowed the Doctor to do his own thing because he knew how to handle the Daleks, and Group Captain Gilmore was very out of his depth, but he did do his part in stopping the Daleks, and he apprehended and arrested Mike when it was revealed that he was a double agent. I liked his character, and his character was very much like the Brigadier, or at least a rip-off of the Brigadier, but not the Brigadier, because the Brigadier wasn't in UNIT at the time, and UNIT hadn't even been formed yet. I'm not gonna speak about what the fuckery that went on in Flux. But then the Doctor actually does call the group captain the Brigadier at one point, and Gilmore responds group captain, so that was a nice little nod to it. And then we have Rachel Jansen. She was the scientific advisor for Captain Gilmore, and she was aiding the Doctor for a good chunk of the story. I liked her, and I liked how Rachel pretty much knew her stuff, and I think that she was very much Liz Shaw and Barbara Wright rolled into one. And of course, Alison, she was Rachel's assistant. She was quite clever as well. She doesn't do a whole lot, but then she does free the Doctor by attacking the Dalek mutant, Imperial Dalek mutant, when he was trying to strangle the Doctor, which was quite cool. She reminded me of a less ditzy version of Jo Grant, but yeah, she was another good character. Then we also have Harry. He owned the cafe and that the characters were dining at, and in part two, he was away with his wife, who was giving birth to twins, and whilst John was away, whilst Harry was away, John was looking after his cafe, and apparently he was meant to have been killed by the Daleks, but then I like that how they pretty much didn't do that. Then we also have John. He was a Jamaican employee of Harry's who looked after the cafe, and whilst Harry was with his wife, and he and the Doctor was actually having discussion about what would happen if there were time ripples all over the place, and he mentions that if sugar never existed, his ancestors would have been enslaved. If the speech was meant to have gone on for a bit longer, but it was obviously, as I said before several times, it was actually cut for time. And of course, he was played by Joseph Marcel, who went on to play Jazz, the butler in Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the American sitcom that pretty much catapulted Will Smith into Hollywood superstardom. And we have Ratcliffe. He was the leader of the Association, which was a fascist group, and he believed that he was on the right side of history this time. Obviously, before the events of the story, he was able to get Harry into the group, and the two started working together never to aid the renegade Daleks. After recovering the Hand of Omega, the renegades saw no use for Ratcliffe's men, and then they had them killed. But then he tried to maroon the Daleks on Earth by destroying their spaceship, but he ended up getting killed by the little girl. And then we have the headmaster slash principal. So as it says in the tin, he is the headmaster of Coal Hill, and he was revealed to be an agent of the Imperial Daleks when he was actually killed when he couldn't get information out of Mike in regards to where the renegades were located. And they have the little girl who was probably one of the best side characters of this story, and she was a creepy little girl that was seen outside Coal Hill, and she was a student of Coal Hill, also indicating that the renegade Daleks were able to get their shit together and failing to realize that they couldn't recognize as a regenerated doctor in the previous Dalek story. So she spends most of the time just skipping around watching events unfold, and it was revealed that she was mentally linked with the Black Dalek, like the Supreme Dalek, so to speak, and when she was seated on the battle computer of the Renegade Daleks, and she had control of the time controller. This gave her powers, and this was like her powers pretty much featured like fatal lightning like coming from her hands, and whenever anyone came into contact with it was instant death. Just ask Mike. When Skara was destroyed along with the Daleks, she was freed from the control and she was comforted by Ace. The expanded media actually named her Judith Winters, and it was mentioned that she never actually recovers from this, and she was just a child, and the Supreme Dalek pretty much used her as a machine of war because a child's imagination can pretty much come up with strategic battle plans to actually defeat the Imperial Daleks, and that's because as we all know that the Renegades weren't actually that good in hidden planning, as that's what led them to lose the Mavellan War and how they in the Fourth Doctor's era. And it was actually mentioned in Survivors of the Flux in Jodie Whittaker's final season, the case file, but saying that she didn't recover, but then it couldn't be made visible on screen. So those were the side characters of the story. And the enemies, we have the Daleks, both Renegade and the Imperials. They're still fighting each other, and they're both using the same means in using enslaving humans to help them out. And then, of course, they both want the Hand of Omega, so they don't have to rely on their time corridors for time travel. So the Imperial Daleks were able to obtain the hand from after getting it from the Renegade, who one of them had actually watched the Doctor bury it in the cemetery. But although this was a part of the Doctor's plan, and the Doctor pretty much abused the Daleks, both Daleks' short-sightedness for the plan. So the Doctor had actually used the hand to destroy the Dalek fleet, which obviously destroyed. I think not necessarily destroyed Davros, but I think he was able to escape. But then the Hand of Omega pretty much was fired towards the sun of Skaro, and which caused it to go into supernova and ended up destroying Skaro. And I love how both of them were very credible threats to the Doctor, although the threat did lie more with the Imperials, but the Renegades were just as deadly because they are using a human child to come up with some battle plan, and of course racist as well to help them with their plans as well. And of course we have Davros, and Davros actually doesn't show up until part 4, claiming himself to be the Emperor of the Imperials. So he was armed with the Hand of Omega, and he wanted the Doctor to, and the Doctor wanted the hand to be returned to him. But then Davros unfortunately fell for the Doctor's manipulations when the Doctor was intentionally angering Davros, which triggered Davros into firing the hand, not knowing that it was targeted to Skaro. But then that's how Skaro met its end. Terry Malloy did a very brilliant job, and I like how Davros took a backseat for at least 95% of the story whilst the Daleks were busy fighting each other. So it was a nice change for other Dalek stories, because other Dalek stories were very much Davros' story, so to speak, with the Daleks just in the background, and doing the lifting whilst Davros was just planning. So Davros is planning, but we don't really see him until the end. So that's a nice change from having Davros doing some of the story, his heavy lifting. I don't think this story has any faults as such, but I do have a nitpick about how the plot can be a bit difficult to understand, but I was able to understand it mostly when I first watched it and after my rewatches 3 years after my first watch. But I didn't really care, and I think this is one of the strengths of the Bokoi era, because even though the plots can be a bit confusing, but then it is still very fun to watch. But because there are lots of very fun moments as well. Oh, but and of course we get to see Daleks fighting each other, and of course the special weapons Dalek, and it does actually help in explaining what the Andrew Cartman Master Plan will be about in future stories as well. And I honestly would have liked to have had at least a mention of Ian and Barbara's whereabouts, because this story was set in November 1963, so maybe there could have been a bit of a reference, maybe from the headmaster saying that the Ian and Barbara are missing, or maybe they could have gone along with the lines of my history teacher and my science teacher, along with my students have gone missing. I haven't seen them since so and so, so I'm wondering where they are. But I think that's something that could have added to the story. But I honestly think that Remembrance of the Daleks is a very fun, action-packed story of very high importance, and it really is the true start of the Sylvester McCoy era, and of course the 25th anniversary season, with the Daleks seemingly gone for good, and it's filled with very fantastic, memorable moments, and it really does pave way for the rest of the season and the following season. So I give this story a perfect 10 out of 10. Yay! So my next review will be The Happiness Patrol, a nice story to ease the craziness of this story, but then Happiness Patrol is a bit dark as well, but I'll explain why when I get to that review. So thanks for watching. Please let me know what you thought of Remembrance of the Daleks and this review itself. Sorry, I'm not my usual self. I am still recovering from a bit of a sore throat, so hence why I'm a bit all over the place, missing a bit. So please subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Until then, see you later.